In rainy weather, in a mountainous area, on the outskirts of the city, there is only one burial place. A long-haired woman in red, they began to open her coffin. Surprisingly, the female body was absolutely unharmed and intact, like a living person. As for why a 2,000-year-old female corpse could look like a beauty who just fell asleep, experts say this is still awaiting proof, saying the event will shake up the archaeological community. Cheng said that this was nonsense, because the city of Changnan had never heard of burials. The driver replied that the latest news was shocking, having said that he will reveal one secret, and in fact the woman's corpse disappeared on the way to the city, although everyone says that this is also nonsense. Yang Cheng asked in rather surprise how a corpse could disappear without any reason. The taxi driver said that he saw with his own eyes how the hearse overturned into a ditch and the coffin disappeared. But this news cannot be published, since it is a national cultural relic. Having reached the indicated place, Ian got out of the taxi and thanked the driver. He took out his phone, and at that moment he paid attention to the girl with an older man. A fairly adult man hugged her and hinted at continuing the party. She smiled carefreely back at him, agreeing to continue the evening with him, after which they headed in an unknown direction. Yang Cheng recognized this girl, which made him literally dumbfounded. He stood in front of them with a beautiful bouquet of flowers the moment she saw him. She was shocked by his sudden appearance and asked what he was doing here. Evil Cheng replied that he went to give her flowers for her birthday, and did not suspect that she was such a golden woman. The girl responded by hitting him with her bag, saying that she had followed him everywhere all these years, and he could not give her anything in return. And now someone else will take care of her, who, in turn, calmly watched what was happening. After which he approached Cheng and boldly declared that he was not worthy of this beautiful girl. Supposedly this was the specialty of poor workers like him. She stood silently aside. Long added that he did not intend to tolerate his presence any longer, and therefore told Cheng to get out of the city. Otherwise, if he still stays in Changnan, it will become a big problem for him. Advising Cheng to be an obedient boy, Cheng asked if he had finished his sad monologue. Then, clenching his fists, he seemed to be unable to control himself, and still attacked Zhang Long, who, in turn, was absolutely cool and calm. Cheng stated that he knew him well. At that moment he flew away from Long's blow and fell on the asphalt. Zhang Long said that he would beat him if Cheng did not get out of here right away. Long, who was already standing, hurried to deliver a few more blows, noticing that he was too excited because of this guy, but Cheng was adamant. The girl felt extremely sorry for Ian. She looked sadly in his direction. Cheng sat beaten on the sidewalk, but clearly not discouraged. Moreover, covered in blood, he began to smile while looking at Zhang Long, who asked the girl if this guy was crazy. She asked Yang to go home, because Long was practicing Muay Thai. Saying that Cheng is not his opponent, she hurried away in the company of Long. Yang wiped the blood from his face and said that Long would not get away with it so easily. After some time, Ian wandered through the dark streets of the city, holding on to lampposts. He had an alcoholic drink in his hands, which he sipped from time to time. Once again, after swallowing more, he felt very intoxicated. As a result, he collapsed to the ground, and thought that this was his end. Ian lay on the ground and looked at the beautiful starry sky and the large lunar disk. At that moment, he saw something shining in a red robe, floating in the air and approaching him. It was an unknown girl who flew up close to him and came face to face. Cheng noticed that he could not move, and he felt very cold. He couldn't believe his eyes, thinking that he had drunk too much alcohol, and he was imagining all this. The unknown woman, meanwhile, looked at him, then pulled out her tongue, after which she began to lick his face. Cheng did not understand what was happening. Suddenly, they kissed. Yang Cheng experienced feelings he did not understand, and he thought that Chang was still strong. The girl was looking at him. Yang thought that this was the one whose body survived several thousand years, and then disappeared without a trace. Cheng seemed to be losing consciousness. His eyes were looking somewhere to the side, as he was still very drunk. The unknown girl said that she would certainly help him become a zombie, after which, opening her mouth, she exposed her sharp fangs and looked at him hungrily. At this moment, Yang Cheng seemed to sober up a little and looked at her. He realized that in fact, she was a female zombie. His pupils dilated. The girl continued to look piercingly into his eyes. Her body began to become covered with veins. At a certain moment, her eyes turned white and she reached out to him with her fangs. The zombie woman bit him on the neck. Cheng still could not resist her. after which some lightning appeared, which literally sparkled in front of him. Cheng tried to figure out whether he had left this world or was still alive. He felt his strength leaving him. Ian suddenly felt sleepy. The girl noticed that his body was gradually dying, and rushed to help him. Biting the immobilized Cheng once again, his dead gaze stared into the heavens. But literally after a while, he began to feel an unexpected surge of strength. Life awakened in him, consciousness returned to Yang Cheng. There was a certain trembling in his hands that he could not control. Then Cheng waved his hand away from the zombie woman, who at that second flew into the air. Ian was shocked by such power, because he felt more alive than the living. She watched his so-called resurrection. Cheng broke the tree and soared into the sky. Noticing that he began to jump very high, there was surprise and misunderstanding on his face. After hovering above the trees for a few seconds in the air, Cheng hurried to return to the ground. Having landed with the same ease, Ian tried to believe what was happening. Cheng began to realize his strength, wondering that he might even have superpowers. Meanwhile, a zombie woman who was floating in the air was slowly approaching him. Yang hurried to run away from her, shouting that ghosts were chasing him. The girl smiled. She found this reaction quite funny. The zombie woman flew after him. Cheng noticed that she was ahead of him, after which he fell to his knees and began to bow to her, asking her to let him go. Ian said that he would burn money on holidays, and would do whatever she said. The girl replied that she didn't know why the money was needed, adding that she was a zombie just like him. Cheng asked how he could be a zombie if he does not have zombie teeth and zombie nails, but has a heartbeat and breathing like a person. She hastened to answer that they have not reached that level, and they just have a good body. The zombie woman noticed that he was always upset, because he now has an endless life and a strong body. Yang Cheng thought about it. He understood that with such strength he could really take care of unfinished business. In addition, Yang was now immortal, and this also gave rise to some thoughts. Cheng asked again if she was really a zombie. She replied that he should not worry about it, since it was not the worst thing, and there is no need to be afraid that he has become a zombie. Yang asked what her name is, because he should know the name of his savior. The zombie woman turned to Cheng and silently looked into his eyes. Then she said sadly that she couldn't remember her name. Yang suggested that she come up with a name. The girl didn't mind, and he began to think, she's been sleeping for about 2,000 years and doesn't remember her name. If you look closely, she looks like a fairy filled with aura. Cheng said that he would call her Xian Ling. The zombie woman happily agreed with him, thanking him for his name, and said that it was time for her to leave. Surprised, Yang Cheng asked where she needed to hurry. Xian hurried to leave, but Yang began to ask how he should live now. After all, she never told what to do next, and what are the nuances in the life of a zombie. Lin turned around and said that he needed to avoid the sun, and if he met a priest, also run away. Ian asked if she was joking and asked what would happen if he didn't have time to escape. Xian said that he would not meet such powerful priests, because nothing could harm God, and there would be no problems. After which Lin handed him an unknown scroll and said that it would help him improve his skills. Urging him to study hard, Cheng took the incomprehensible scroll and looked after her. Xian hurried to hide in some lightning. Yang tried to stop her. Then Lin completely disappeared. Cheng said that he wanted to file a complaint. Then he sat down on the ground to study the contents of this scroll. There were drawn little men there, and the description consisted of words unknown to him. Yang angrily rolled up the scroll and hurried off in an unknown direction. Cheng wanted to tell her that he did not take anything useful out of this document, since he did not understand a word. He headed to the road where he caught a car to finally go home. Cheng got into the car, and feeling some weakness, fell asleep safely. Then, when he woke up, he noticed that this day was quite incredible, as he met a cute zombie girl. And the most interesting and no less strange thing is that Cheng himself became a zombie. Stretching out his arms he looked at them. Ian began to talk about the fact that tomorrow there might be news about the appearance of zombies in the city. He also wondered whether his teeth would grow back. Or big claws. Getting out of the car, Ian noticed that he had been driving for a very long time, after which he immediately headed into the alley, with the scroll under his arm. Suddenly, he heard voices talking about the loss of the body of a 2,000-year-old woman in the area. One of them said that he heard strange sounds, suggesting that it was a female corpse. Another hurried him to shut his mouth and not scare him, because in this way they would lose their reputation as true robbers. And they still need to find this female corpse in order to get rich. At that moment Cheng's eyes were blinded by a flashlight, from which he closed his eyes and tried to hide with his hand. A robber with a bat ordered Ian to immediately give up all the valuables he had. Yang Cheng looked into his eyes angrily and confidently said that he would not give them anything. The leader ordered his accomplices to beat this guy so that he would surrender and give them all his money. Cheng replied that he doesn't mind treating them all to food, but that's the only way he can help them. In response, the robbers laughed and called him a coward who was allegedly afraid of them, which Ian clearly didn't like. He said a second later that he had changed his mind, and showing them $10, he replied that if they could take it from him, then the money would become theirs. One of the robbers turned to the main one, saying that this guy was now trying to humiliate them. The embittered leader ordered them to immediately deal with the upstart. At that moment, the angry Cheng himself dealt him a powerful blow, and he dropped the bat from his hands, and he flew to the side, hitting the iron gate that was behind him quite hard. He slowly slid down, bleeding, and seemed to lose consciousness. The rest watched what was happening, and did not understand where this guy got such strength from. Yang Cheng was also extremely surprised by his power, assuming that he had died. At this time, one of the unlucky robbers attacked him with a knife. Cheng easily knocked his hand aside, thereby preventing himself from being hurt. And with an evil look he looked at him and the others. For a moment everyone froze. After which, the robber tried to hit Ian again, who in turn grabbed his hand. And he squeezed it hard. He screamed in unimaginable pain, but could not resist such force. He literally cried and said that he was in great pain. Ian did not let him go. Then he asked if the last robbery was theirs. He pressed harder and harder. The robber literally begged him to let him go, saying that they would not do this again. Yang Cheng threw it aside like a rag and headed towards the others. They, in turn, backed away and did not even think about attacking him. Yang said that no one else would dare to call him a coward. After which, they fled in fear in different directions, not wanting to contact him anymore. Cheng understood perfectly well that the advantage was on his side, which he took advantage of. Ian jumped from behind, onto the remaining frightened would-be robbers. Inflicting crushing blows to one of them in the head, he bled to death. Cheng landed on the ground and watched as the other tried to escape. Yang immediately pushed off the ground and flew into the heights to catch up with him. And with the same kick, he literally drove his head into the concrete fence. The blow was so strong that small cracks appeared along the wall. Yang Cheng stood in the middle of the robbers he had beaten, scattered to the sides. And he was about to leave when he suddenly felt something incomprehensible to him. Ian did not understand what was happening to him, and what kind of feeling he was experiencing. It was as if his consciousness was turning over, his breathing became faster and his gaze became crazy. His eyes were bloodshot, the unknown feeling only intensified. Cheng glanced at the bully, under whom a large pool of blood had formed. Then he looked at the other beaten and bloodied robber. Cheng seemed to be drawn to them by something. His veins were bulging, and his eyes were bulging. Then they became white and as if without pupils. Yang raised his head up, and he screamed furiously into the sky, as if a force unknown to him was awakening in him. The teeth instantly turned into sharp fangs, and Cheng began to shake all over. Ian still didn't understand what was happening to him and how to deal with it. Looking again at one of the beaten and bloodied robbers, Cheng began to realize that he was attracted by the smell of blood, and he wanted to bite his neck. At that moment he noticed the moon, which was very large, and immensely beautiful. With his eyes wide open, he peered at her carefully. At a certain moment, it was as if this incomprehensible state began to let go of him. Cheng literally felt the trembling disappear from his hands, and his breathing became even. Yang took another look at the unusually beautiful lunar disk. He noticed that in addition to his physical capabilities, his vision also improved. Meanwhile, unknown hazes began to appear in the sky, floating somewhere, which soon embraced his body, and Ian began to lift himself off the ground, closing his eyes. Cheng seemed to be floating on the waves, feeling some kind of peace, and began to disappear. After a few moments, Ian took a deep breath and exhaled with relief. Then he slowly opened his eyes and looked around. Cheng told the robbers that they were lucky today, and next time he would not let them go so easily. Then he went out through the gate and hurried to leave the scene. Yang Cheng, thoughtfully, headed to his home to get some rest. After such an eventful day, he calmly took a shower and tried to calm down. Afterwards, Cheng headed to his room, drying his hair with a towel. Then he took the scroll that the zombie woman gave him and sat down on the bed, trying to read at least something again. Ian thought that maybe he just needed to repeat all these movements that were drawn on paper. He peered at the poses of the little men and realized that it was not so simple. Cheng stabilized his breathing and began to repeat all these movements. Pose after pose, movement after movement, he diligently tried to repeat everything as in the pictures. After a while, Ian felt that he was quite tired. Walking past the slightly open window, Ian noticed the bright moon, which shone directly at him. Cheng froze for a few seconds. Unexpectedly, Yang was surprised to inhale a very pleasant aroma from the street. He caught himself thinking that he felt much better. Cheng felt great. His fangs began to grow again. Ian remembered that it was necessary to continue training. Ian again began to assume various supposedly fighting poses in front of the window. He was immersed in this kind of meditation, and persistently studied new movements. After which, Ian seemed to have an epiphany, and he understood why all this was needed. These pictures talked about 12 ways to absorb the essence of the moon. Cheng then hurried to regain his breathing and continue training. Ian was well aware that a completely different life had begun for him, in which he will never again live as a coward, because the old Ian would already be dead by this moment. The next day, they called him from work to find out where he was going. While Ian had just left the house, he replied that he would be there soon and hung up. Cheng drew attention to the burning sun, which in turn was shining brightly. He squinted and shielded himself from it with his hand. The sun seemed to increase in degree with every second. Cheng thought it was only 9 in the morning, and it was too hot outside. Suddenly his hands began to become covered with burns, and hissed as if they were being roasted on a fire. Ian quickly ran home to figure out what could be done about this problem. He took his sunglasses, because he understood that he had no other choice, and also a cap to prevent his head from getting baked in the sun, because he has become more susceptible to it. After which he hurried to work. People turned to him and looked at him in surprise, because it was not so hot outside. And there wasn't much sun either. When I arrived at my service in the security room, he met an employee who asked him to sign documents. And he said that the boss was upset when he didn't see Cheng, but the assistant brushed him off, saying that Yang was in the toilet. At that moment, an unknown person ran into the room and loudly slammed the door. Cheng realized that they were going to be robbed, and he informed the employee about it. An unknown robber entered the diamond processing department and shouted. Holding a pistol in his hand, he stated that everyone is obliged to cooperate with him, and whoever refuses will see the barrel of a pistol. All the people fell to the floor in fright and grabbed their heads, causing panic. At this time, his accomplice approached him with a bag in his hands and said that there were plenty of diamonds here. The main villain urged him to take only processed diamonds and not raw ones. Meanwhile, a door opened behind him. It was Cheng, at whom the robber pointed a gun and said that he would shoot him. Ian, in turn, was determined and wanted to prevent him. But at that moment he saw the boss's hand in front of him, who was trying to protect his employee. He said that they can take the diamonds, but the hostages must be safe, otherwise they will not escape. The robber replied that Boss Yu is a rather generous jewel king, whom he did not expect to see here. And in connection with which he changed his plan a little. He loaded the gun and pointed it at Boss Yu, saying that he is more worthy of robbery than these diamonds they came for. While at gunpoint, he asked the robber in surprise how he knew him. He replied that he could not help but know a famous businessman in Changnan. At this moment, the cunning Yang Cheng took advantage of the fact that the robber was distracted. He threw his phone directly at the hand holding the gun, thereby knocking out the weapon. The criminal grabbed his hand and screamed in pain. He clearly did not expect such a turn. Ian, in turn, thought through further actions, and understood that there was only one way out. The robber continued to hold on to his hand without picking up the gun from the floor. Cheng realized that this was a great chance to finish what he started, and rushed towards him. And he dealt him a strong blow to the chest area. The criminal did not have time to do anything. And he flew into the elevator doors, while his accomplice rushed for a pistol. Cheng understood that he needed to act very quickly. Boss Yu was shocked by his employee Yang's fighting ability. The robber pointed the gun at Cheng, saying that no one dare attack his boss. After which he still shot at Ian. The bullet flew into his chest area. And the deformed one bounced off his body, falling to the floor. Everyone was shocked. Cheng continued to stand in place alive. The criminal was at a loss. No one understood how this was possible. Boss Yu also watched what was happening in a stupor. He thought that Yang had the legendary martial arts body armor, not realizing who Cheng really was. The boss understood that it would be extremely difficult to fulfill Madame Chu's order. Cheng, meanwhile, took care of the robber. who called him a monster. Ong replied that he was an ordinary security guard who was doing his job, after which he immediately twisted the criminal's arm, thus bringing him to his knees. At this moment, the third approached Cheng from behind. Yang paid attention. The same one stabbed him in the back with a sledgehammer, part of which remained on Ian's back. He turned around, the frightened criminal asked for his forgiveness, and cracks appeared in the sledgehammer. Cheng immediately hit him, sending the robber flying several meters back. A second later, all the robbers knelt in front of Cheng, begging for their life, saying that it was not their idea. Ian noticed that just a minute ago they were all so brave. Meanwhile, the police were approaching the scene, their flashing lights could be heard. The next day at Madame Chu's house, a car drove into the yard. Madame Chu was calmly doing yoga and meditation at that moment. She was in one of the poses on the mat at the moment when Yu Cheng approached her. He immediately called out to her to tell her that he had found the right person. Madame Chu turned to him and asked him if he had come to her with good news. Yu hastened to answer that he had found the performer. It turned out to be an employee of their company, whose details he sent to her on WeChat. She listened to him carefully, after which she took her phone and began to look through it. His name was Yang Cheng. He was a 24-year-old man with no parents, and was adopted by an unknown man. Ian had a secondary education, no social status and a clean reputation. He works as a security guard at a jewelry factory. Yu Cheng said that he could vouch for this guy, adding that he has a good character. Madame Chu said that Li is a spoiled child, and she has already driven away dozens of bodyguards, hoping that this will be the last time. The next day, Cheng came into Boss Yu's office and asked why the president had called him. Boss Yu hurried to answer with a smile that he had been looking for him and asked him to listen to him. He said that he was just a representative, and the president was Mrs. Chu, and he introduced Yang to her. Hoping that Cheng would become her bodyguard, Yang asked if Boss Yu wanted him to protect Miss Chu. He said that it's not exactly like that, but rather her daughter, who is studying at the university in her second year, and everything that is required from Ian. It's always and everywhere to be by her side until she finishes her training, to protect her, Cheng thought. Boss Yu laughed and said that Yang was actually very lucky, and he hurried to take him to introduce him to the miss whom he would have to defend. After a while, they stood in front of the gate of Chu Mansion, and Boss Yu rang the bell. The surly miss said that Uncle Yu would drive away the new bodyguard, and then she would open the gate. Yu replied that this is one of the best bodyguards there is, saying that she probably doesn't want to. For history to repeat itself again, the response was silence, which lasted for several seconds, after which the entrance gate opened, and Yang and Boss Yu headed inside. Suddenly, at this moment, she rushed at Cheng with a bat and tried to hit him. He, in turn, managed to react with lightning speed and hit the bat, which thereby flew to the side. The girl stood opposite him. A wooden bat landed with a crash a few meters away from them. Miss Chu was extremely angry, and Boss Yu watched in shock. She stated that Ian has no right to raise his hand against her, never under any circumstances. After which she immediately went to the bat and picked it up from the ground. And again she swung it towards Cheng, who in turn noticed that she was wearing pink underwear. Yang easily dodged the blow, and noticed that she was quite beautiful. He dodged her blows again and again, while simultaneously looking at her figure, which she noticed and was literally beside herself, screaming angrily at him. She said that she would scratch out his eyes if he continued to look at her like that. Yang replied that he would stop staring if he stopped attacking him. At this moment, Boss Yu introduced this ill-mannered girl as Madame Chu Yi Xian Lin, saying that she was raised as a boy, and even learned some martial arts, but of course not comparable to his skills. After which, Cheng turned to Miss Chu and asked if he had passed the test. She rudely replied that there would be a second test. Xian looked for something in her purse for a long time, then finally took out a certain sheet of paper from there. And she said that her bodyguard should study well, asking Ian to finish his English essay. With an arrogant look, Cheng asked if this was her homework. Evil Miss Chu said that he barely passed this test, but he shouldn't relax, because she has a final test for him, which he may not be able to cope with. Xian immediately led him along the pool and said that these people were her bodyguards. She pointed to the men in black suits. And if Yang defeats them all, he will pass the final test, but if not, then he will leave her house. The same arrogant Cheng asked whether everyone should be beaten at once, or one by one. Xian replied that since he is so skilled, then all four are against him alone, at the same time, adding that if Ian is afraid, it is better for him to give up immediately, because he could get seriously hurt. Cheng confidently stated that there is no such word surrender in his dictionary, since he never gives up. The embittered little Lin said that she wanted to check where he got such confidence from, after which, she ordered her bodyguards to immediately beat Cheng. One of them asked which arm he should break, but the second hurried him to choose, since they might say that they were mocking him. Ian replied that he was afraid of overdoing it and leaving them disabled for life. One of the bodyguards rushed with a blow, which Cheng easily dodged, after which he calmly lit a cigarette, thereby deliberately irritating them. Ian slowly sipped his cigarette and smiled at the guards who did not understand anything. Then he called on them to fight without sparing their strength, which made them go crazy, and all four of them rushed at him at the same time, calling on each other to beat him to death. The first bodyguard flew to the side, not understanding how it happened. Following him, the others suffered the same thing. Among the scattered guards, Ian finished smoking his cigarette. Xian understood that he was too fast, and therefore dealt with the bodyguards. Cheng, in turn, walked towards her with the gait of a winner. Lin began to back away. As a result, she suddenly stumbled and lost one of her slippers, and she was already falling with her back to the ground, but at that moment the valiant knight, named Yang Cheng, who managed to catch her on the fly and held her in his arms. They looked into each other's eyes for several seconds. Ian admired this small, but arrogant and spoiled girl. Noticing this, she hurried to ask him to finally let her go. Cheng replied that he would let her go if in return she fulfilled what she promised. Xian agreed, saying that from now on she would obey Uncle Yu, and asked to let her go. Yang took his hands away from her, and she ran a few meters away from him. Then she turned around and said that she would arrange something else for him when he became her bodyguard. Meanwhile, it was already late evening when Ian decided to meditate. Suddenly he heard some buzzing to the side, and wanted to understand what was happening. Cheng opened his eyes and saw in front of him an unknown cloud, from which incomprehensible haze emanated. Yang thought that the cloud sphere wanted to take away his power, and wanted to prevent this. Cheng extended his hand trying to catch him, but he clearly failed, and as if teasing him, it continued to fly in front of Ian's face. He became angry. And again he tried to catch this haze, saying that he didn't know who he was, but he would still get him. Cheng literally jumped on the roofs of houses in pursuit of the unknown. At a certain moment, still managing and reacting with lightning speed, he grabbed the haze. Yang held the unknown in his hands, saying that he had finally caught him, and now he would not run away. I began to think about what to do with it. Suddenly the cloud sphere began to resonate. A few seconds later there was a strong explosion, after which the sphere dispersed into smoke. Cheng noticed that he had injuries in the form of burns on his arm after the haze explosion. Ian looked around and saw this round sphere near the concrete wall. Only she was already smaller in size, and as if hiding from Cheng, she was lying to the side. He asked her why she was not as fierce as before. After which, he picked up this sparkling ball and began to examine its perfectly rounded shape. Yang thought that his blood could be sucked out by this incomprehensible sphere. Suddenly, the ball of energy disappeared before his eyes. Cheng did not understand where it could have gone, and he noticed that he had a small round fragment left in his hand from the haze, which literally grew into Ian's skin. He began asking him questions about who he was and where he came from. At a certain moment, something incomprehensible began to happen to this fragment, and literally a moment later, a brightly glowing ball seemed to crawl out of his palm. Cheng asked him if he wanted to go with him, and the answer was only a muffled squeak. Ian began to poke him with his finger, and smiling said that he would call him a little milk ball. After which, I went home to sleep, since it was already quite late, and the next day, waking up in the morning in a fighting mood, Cheng hurried to work. He also woke up his new friend, in the form of a milk ball. Yang thought that this was his first day of work with the spoiled Xian, who still needed to be found. After brushing his teeth and quickly getting dressed, he immediately headed to Lin's house. Cheng called the house, the doors of which opened in front of him a second later. He walked further along the corridor, and finding the door to her room, he carefully opened it, thereby noticing that there was a bucket on it. Yang smiled, realizing that these were childish games of a spoiled young girl. Cheng suddenly opened the doors wide, and the bucket began to slowly fall down. Yang took a sharp step forward, causing the bucket of water to fall behind him. After which, he appeared before Xian safe and sound, and most importantly dry. Cheng looked at her arrogantly, then jokingly asked why she was so unhappy. Lin told him to leave her alone. She gave him a tour of the house, telling him that their rooms were on the same floor. Only his is on the east side of the house, and her room is on the west side, and he will have to go around the whole house, if anything happens. Ian liked to watch her childish habits, and the fact that she tried in every possible way to annoy him, he found it funny. Having shown and told him everything, Xian hurried to the opposite side of the house, and suddenly heard a squeak. She immediately returned to Cheng asking what the squeak was. Yang pretended not to hear anything. Lin asked him again. He replied that it was most likely her imagination. But the irrepressible girl claimed that the squeak came from his direction. She then reached her hand towards him, and Cheng said that she was looking for a reason to touch him, which greatly offended him as a person. Xian immediately blushed with anger, but did not know how to answer him. After which she quickly ran to her room, to her western part. At this moment, Ian took the ball out of his inner jacket pocket and placed it on his shoulder. And he hastened to explain to him that it was the devil girl who almost discovered him. In response, he just continued to squeak, by which time night had already fallen. Cheng, as always, sat on the bed and meditated before going to bed, but suddenly, he saw in front of him an incomprehensible black spot hanging from above the balcony. Having looked closely, he realized that this was a man whose face was stained with blood. Ian came closer and thought that on his very first day they started playing a prank. Then, looking out of the window, he discovered that it was the head of a mannequin hanging from the ropes. And I thought that to such a prank, he could respond to the young lady with something. Cheng sneaked into her room unnoticed and was already approaching the bed where she was sleeping. Noticing that she is nice, but still the same little devil who spoils people, Yang carefully extended the head of the mannequin towards the side of her bed, after which he slowly hung it up and just as quietly walked away from the bed. Yang Cheng hurriedly left her room, noticing that he could see through things. The next morning, Cheng was awakened by Xian's sudden scream and hurried to her room. Yang ran into Lin's room and immediately asked why she was screaming and what happened. An angry Mrs. Chu, holding the mannequin's head in her hands, slowly turned towards Cheng. Then she sharply threw it at Ian, and asked if he was happy with his antics. He pretended that he didn't understand what he was talking about. Xian said that it was time for them to go to school, and after some time, they came to the school where Lin studied. Mrs. Chu confidently walked forward. Cheng was catching up behind her at this moment. All male representatives turned to Xian and shouted that they loved her. One of them turned to the shouter and said that if Bob Zhou heard him, he would be in trouble. He, in turn, asked what were the chances that Bob would appear here now and hear him, at which time Zhou called out to him, who said that he heard everything perfectly. He looked rather pretentious. The guy said that he was joking. Bob looked at him arrogantly, and then replied that he was not a stingy person. After all, Xian Lin loves only him anyway, and will be with him. Mrs. Chu heard his confident statement towards her and asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about, after which she immediately said that she really didn't like him, urging him not to be so arrogant. At this moment, Cheng approached Lin and tried to calm her down by extending his hand to her, which was not to the liking of Bob Zhou, who immediately boiled over. He hurried to flex his fists, and then addressed Yang in a rude manner, asking what right he has to stand next to his beloved girl. In response, Cheng ignored him and took Xian aside. Bob became even more angry. He immediately attacked Ian from behind, with words about speedy reprisals against him. At that moment, an unknown girl appeared and rudely asked Zhou what he was doing. The male half of the students were again in euphoria from her presence. Lin hurried to greet the teacher. Bob also turned to her. Xian whispered in Cheng's ear that this was their Chinese teacher, whose name was Luo Bing. She slowly turned her gaze towards Mrs. Chu and asked her what happened here. Bob said that nothing happened, just a small misunderstanding, and apologetically said that this would not happen again. Teacher Bing turned back to Xian and asked if everything was okay. She assured her that everything was fine, at which time Luo turned her attention to Yang, who was standing next to Lin. After which, Teacher Bing headed to the school. The others looked after her. Xian and Yang also walked towards the school. Bob, watching them, thought that he would have beaten Cheng if not for the teacher. Yang, in turn, asked Lin if the guy was a classmate. She replied that he liked to irritate her all the time, but Xian did not expect that it would get even worse. Everyone finally entered the classroom, and Teacher Bing said that they had a new student. At this moment, he came out and introduced himself to everyone as Yang Cheng. Having added that he was glad to meet them, Teacher Luo looked at him smiling and nodded her head. Opinions about the newcomer in the class varied. Some girls liked him, while others were not happy. After finishing the lesson, Cheng went to the toilet, where he met the intrusive Bob and his crowd. Zhou confronted Yang for standing next to his girlfriend Xian, calling on him to behave modestly, because he had just arrived and had already drawn all the attention to himself. The students crowded in the corridor, watching from the sidelines. Ian was absolutely calm, and replied that he didn't care who he was, demanding that they get out of the way. Bob Zhou was outraged by this behavior of the newcomer, and hastened to deal with him with the help of his gang. He turned to them and said that this guy was completely insolent. Not only was he walking with his girlfriend, but he was also talking like a greyhound. After which, Bob immediately jumped on Cheng, trying to stab him. Yang, in turn, easily caught his fist and began to hold it. Zhou was confused, realizing that he had a furious reaction. In this connection, he hastened to call for help from his narrow-minded brothers. They certainly complied with his demand, and subsequently attacked Cheng, which Yang just as casually scattered to the sides. One after another they fell off their feet. Meanwhile, there was only one bully left who did not tempt fate, and Bob, whom Cheng grabbed by the neck and lifted above the ground, making it clear who was in charge here, after which he threw it towards the wall against which Zhou hit. Yang stood proudly over him, saying that he could come for revenge at any time. He then went to Xian, who was watching on the sidelines as all the students shouted his name. Lin was also delighted with Yang, since he had dealt with the main object of her irritation. She told him that she didn't know how strong Cheng was, which made her very pleasantly surprised. Xian looked at him mysteriously. He thought that Lin was a pretty nice girl when she didn't harm anyone. Ian said that they needed to leave, because a lot of people had already gathered. Joyful Lin took his arm, and with a smile on her face replied that they should hurry to class. Among the crowd of students, there was someone unknown who looked at Cheng angrily. Yang noticed the stranger, but did not understand who it could be. He and Lin continued to move into the classroom. Meanwhile, it was already noon, and there was not much left until the end of all lessons. Yang noticed that his hand was hissing again from the rays of the sun. Cheng understood that a zombie's body was perfect, except for exposure to the sun, but by increasing his level he would have immunity. The only thing is that Cheng had no idea how long it would take to rise in level. At this moment, his thoughts were interrupted by Xian, who called him to have lunch. Yang hastened to refuse such a tempting offer, inviting her to have lunch herself. What Lin really didn't like was that she said that food here only costs a few bucks. Cheng noted that he needed an umbrella, as he was a little afraid of sunlight. He understood that he probably looked ridiculous in the eyes of young Lin. Xian, in turn, could not stand it and laughed loudly in response. After some time, they walked to the counter where they purchased an umbrella. And they walked along the street together. Passers-by paid attention to them and were surprised. At some point, Lin asked if he had ever met a girl, since he did not know how to behave with her. At that same second, Cheng remembered his ex and her new elderly man. Yang, without answering the question, was literally saddened that Xian noticed. She asked what she had done wrong. Suddenly a strong wind rose. They continued walking along the street. Cheng noticed that the sign of one of the stores began to sway from the wind. Noticing that she had completely broken away and was already flying down, Yang pushed Lin away from him. As a result, she landed painfully on the sidewalk, but remained alive. Cheng, in turn, caught and held a huge advertising sign with his hands. He then threw her aside on the ground. Xian was shocked by Yang's strength. Cheng looked at the tall building from which part of the sign had fallen off. Lin carefully asked if everything was okay with his shoulder. An replied that everything was fine. He thought that this sign had just recently been installed, so it couldn't come off on its own. Suspecting that someone contributed to her falling off the roof of the building, Xian still couldn't believe that Yang had caught the part of the sign that had just come off with his own hands. Cheng carefully examined the building, realizing that there was no one on the roof. Lin asked him what was wrong with him. Yang, in turn, hurried her to leave here. After which, he confidently stated that today they would not return home in her car. Xian looked at him in surprise and asked how they would get home in this case. Ian replied that they would go on a bicycle, following her car. Meanwhile, it was already late evening and they were heading home. Cheng and Lin were riding a bicycle. He was driving, and Xian was sitting behind him holding on to him. At a certain moment, a truck leaving a turn made a sharp sound of brakes. Thus, he crashed into the side of the car they were following. Yang and Lin watched in horror what happened. Everything happened quite quickly. They rushed to help, but found the driver already dead in the car. Cheng noticed that there was no one in the truck, and realized that someone was trying to eliminate Xian. Yang hurried to get on his bike and take Yilin away from danger. After some time, at Madame Chu's house, Cheng said that from the moment the sign fell, he already suspected something was wrong. She asked him again. Ian nodded his head confirming his suspicions. He wanted to ask her again about some strange things. Mrs. E hurried him to ask the question that interested him so much. Cheng asked if she had crossed anyone's path lately, since everything that was happening seemed rather strange to him, adding that Miss Xian is just a capricious girl who could not have enemies who want her dead. Mrs. Chu thought for a moment, then replied that she has a lot of business rivals, and recently she bankrupted Jinghua Technology. In just one night, she took away all their property worth 200 billion, Yang heard about it on the news. And soon after the bankruptcy, it was reported that the boss of Jinghua Technology committed suicide by jumping from the roof of the building. Mrs. Chu turned to Yang and asked if he was horrified by this news. He replied that there was a little bit of that. She said that women in this world have a difficult life, and therefore sometimes have to take extreme measures. Cheng said that in this case, he would study all the available information about Jinghua. The lady replied that she was counting on him. Literally in the evening, Ian went to one of the night bars in the city. He sat at the table in thought at the moment and the waitress brought him his order, in whom he recognized Qian. She, in turn, also recognized Brother Yang. Qian paused at his table for a short time and began to have a nice conversation with Cheng. She said that she had not seen him for a long time, but heard that Ian quit his old job because he found a better option. Cheng modestly replied that this was not entirely true. Qian noticed that he had not ordered such expensive drinks before, and therefore, she noticed that he was lying to her. Yang understood that little Qian had wised up, and invited her to have a drink with him after work. Qian kindly agreed. Cheng slowly drank his expensive drink. At a certain point, Yang heard someone forcing Qian to drink with him and his company. She, in turn, politely answered Mr. Tiger that she had no right to drink at work, and asked to let her go. But he didn't let up, he just smiled back, and was still persistent. After which, he forcibly poured alcohol on her, holding her head with his hands, saying that he would help her, since he could not drink it herself. At that moment, the bottle of alcohol suddenly flew out of his hands. Tiger immediately turned around and saw the evil Yang Qing standing in front of him, who demanded to leave the girl behind. Qian immediately ran behind Yang. Meanwhile, Tiger's gang instantly surrounded them from all sides. He stated that no one has the right to interfere in his affairs, especially such a brat like Yang, and ordered his soldiers to seize him. Without hesitation, Cheng, in turn, hastened to strike him with a strong blow, which hit Tiger right in the stomach, as a result of which he flew to the side. The blow was so strong that his mouth began to bleed, which Tiger clearly did not expect. Already crawling on the floor on his knees, through a strong cough, he ordered his accomplices to kill Ian. After a few seconds, having come to his senses a little, Tiger repeated his instructions. They instantly attacked Cheng with reinforcements, but this did not help them either, because Ian easily and naturally dealt with them one by one. People watching what was happening noticed that he wouldn't get away with it so easily, because Tiger is not a weakling. Cheng dealt with the remaining hooligans just as effortlessly. After a while, they were all carelessly scattered around the room. Ian wiped the blood from his face, after which he went to the observers. They, in turn, became nervous. At this moment, Tiger, beaten by Cheng, moved slowly and painfully on all fours. He literally begged Ian to spare him, and tearfully asked to be released. But Cheng was adamant. He quickly grabbed him by the neck with his hand, and raised him above the ground. Tiger tried in vain to get out, grabbing Ian's hand with his hands. Enraged, Cheng simply threw him aside like a rag towards the exit. Everyone present was shocked by the unimaginable strength of Yen. Tiger meanwhile, having already landed rather painfully, Cheng headed towards Qian. The beaten Tiger lay on the ground without moving or making any sounds. Yang looked at them again, making sure that no one else was able to attack him. Little Qian met him with a frightened look. She didn't know what to tell him. Chen silently walked up to her and took her hand, then turning to everyone, he said, that everyone who misbehaves will end up just like Tiger and his henchmen. After which, Qian immediately led the way, leaving this unfavorable place. At a certain moment, Ian noticed that she had fallen behind him. Turning around, he saw that she felt bad, and Qian began to cough. Then she bent down to the floor, and holding onto the wall, covered her mouth with her other hand. A few seconds later she felt worse and vomited. Ian realized that things were bad. He said that they need to find a place where she will feel much better. Little Qian agreed helplessly, looking at him sadly with drunken eyes. They immediately left the bar and headed to his home. Yang gently held Qian by the shoulders and opened the front door of his apartment. Cheng carefully helped her get to the bed and told her to lie down for a while he brought her anti-alcohol pills. He noticed that Qian was breathing heavily and hurried to go out to get the pills. The front door slammed and the baby felt very hot at that moment. Meanwhile, Cheng had already found a pharmacy and went in to buy anti-alcohol pills, after which, he calmly went out and lit a cigarette, heading home. Ian thought that it had been quite an eventful day. Arriving home, he hurried to open the front door and said that he was already back. However, Cheng did not find her in the bed, and began to look for her around the apartment, at the same time shouting her name. He walked to the bathroom, from which little Qian's voice could be heard. She said that she would wash herself properly and come out, asking him to wait a little. Yang, meanwhile, poured water into a glass and put 2 tablets to make her feel better. Suddenly, the door from the bathroom opened slightly, from which Qian sauntered out. Moving slowly around the apartment, she walked towards Ian barefoot. At that moment he turned to her and said that her medicine was ready. Little Qian stood in only a shirt on the threshold of the room. Cheng was surprised. He hurried her to go and dress normally, because she was only wearing a shirt. Qian, in turn, came closer to him and threw herself into his arms, saying that he was not looking at her. Then she pushed him back onto the bed. Yang fell onto the soft bed. Little Qian hurried to climb up to him, giving Cheng hints in every possible way. Ian, in turn, dissuaded her, saying that it was unnecessary to do this. Qian sadly said that she really wanted to be in his arms. He looked at her pitifully, gradually realizing that Qian usually falls asleep after drinking alcohol, but today something is wrong with her. It suddenly dawned on him that it was not actually alcohol, but an aphrodisiac. Yang grabbed the blanket, realizing that he had let that bastardly Hu go too soon, and he hurried to wrap little Qian in it, who did not understand what Cheng was doing. She kicked, not letting him do it. Ian tried to calm her down. Then, after wrapping her in a blanket and tying her with a belt, he said that he was doing this for her own good, and when she comes to her senses after a while, she will thank him for what he did. Little Qian fell fast asleep and slept safely until the morning. She slowly opened her sleepy eyes and looked around. Cheng, noticing that she had woken up, greeted her and smilingly stated that morning had already come. Qian's head was throbbing. After yesterday, she sat up on the bed, and I noticed that I was only wearing a shirt, and was shocked. And she screamed loudly, covering herself with a blanket from Cheng. She said with tears in her eyes, that she trusted him, and he did this to her. Yang hastened to explain everything to her. And after some time, Qian already apologized to Cheng, saying that she misunderstood him, and on the contrary, thanked him for everything. Yang said that everything was fine and she didn't have to apologize, after which he handed her her clothes. Yang then asked how she knew Li Hu, and how long she had known him. Qian replied that he came to their bar from time to drink, and she usually served him, but she did not know that he was from the Dragon Gang. Also, the Black Dragon didn't come last night, but Li Hu forced her to drink. Cheng noticed that it was a setup. Qian said that she wanted to quit, but the Black Dragon always finds her everywhere. Yang thought for a moment, and then replied that this gang should be eliminated, along with their leader. Qian hastened to dissuade him, because one person is not able to cope with a whole gang of hooligans. But Cheng, confident in himself, said that he was not going to die. Besides, he was not the same as he was before. Yang immediately turned to Qian for help, from whom he asked for an advance payment. She jokingly asked if his salary would be enough for 6 months, and wondered if he had knocked anyone up. After a short period of time, Cheng brought the money to little Qian. She was shocked by such an act, and asked where he got that kind of money. Ian replied that it was his income, and asked to take 10,000. And not to worry about anything. He thought that it was quite unusual to share a double room with a woman that night. After which I thought about the Black Dragon Gang and my further actions. Some time later, after walking several streets, Yang finally arrived at the place. Looking at the entrance to the casino, Cheng thought that he had come to the right place and drew attention to the security. There were plenty of them. They were both at the entrance and along the perimeter of the building. Ian understood that the verification process here was very strict, but this did not stop him, and he hurried to get inside. At the entrance, the guard scanned him and then let him through. Cheng exchanged the money for chips and began to look for someone who could go bankrupt. At that moment, a beauty approached him and invited him to play. On the other hand, a guy approached him and also invited him to play. Yang hugged them and led them to the gaming tables, saying that he was a beginner who needed to be taught to play. The girl agreed. The guy replied that he was a beginner himself, but literally a few minutes later, Ian got a royal flush. Thus, having hit a big jackpot, he gave the newcomer a chip in the amount of 500, thanking him for his cooperation. He, in turn, could not understand how this happened, and Ian was so lucky. At that moment, through the crowd of people, that same black dragon was making his way with his gang. One of the casino workers hastened to fawn on him, saying that he was very glad to have him there. Ian caught himself thinking that since the dragon himself had come, the task was simplified. At this time, one of the crowd ran out calling out to the black dragon, and he declared that he bankrupted him, which he would not forgive the dragon, attacking him with his fists. The guards became active at that very second and began to protect the black dragon. Thus, by brutally beating the man half to death, the dragon called on the guards to be tougher. One of the guards said that he had no right to try to harm bro dragon. A young guy ran to the man's defense and asked him to stop beating his father. The guard said that he would finish him off, along with his unfortunate father. The young man had already closed his eyes, preparing to be beaten. But at this time, Yang grabbed the guard's fist and asked him how he could beat the child. The black dragon's bodyguard asked who he was. Ian responded with a lightning-fast kick to the face, after which, the fat guard flew to the side and fell to the floor with a crash. At that moment, another came at Ian from behind with a dagger, trying to wound him. The man who had been beaten earlier shouted to Cheng that there was a threat behind him. The dagger was already quite close to Yang's back, but he was just as fast. He managed to turn around and deliver a crushing kick to the stomach. Thus, he literally kicked the bully to the heights, which he clearly did not expect. And immediately, he threw this bloody body in the other direction, where he landed extremely painfully on the floor, still not understanding where such strength came from in Yen. The dagger soared upward, after which, spinning in the air, it rapidly accelerated downward. He was easily caught by Cheng, who looked at the others arrogantly. In search of the black dragon, who in turn quickly left the casino, Yang told the two terrified guards to give Dragon his message that if he became annoying, Tuo Cheng will finish him off once and for all, at which time one of them dropped the fire extinguisher from his hands out of fear. Meanwhile, it was already getting cold outside as it was late evening. Ian hurried to help the beaten man get up from his knees, asking what happened. He and his son, in turn, thanked Cheng, because if it weren't for him, they would already be dead. Yang asked why he went alone, and why they needed the black dragon at all. A man told a sad story about how his wife committed suicide because there was not enough money to treat her son, but he couldn't stop playing in the casino. She borrowed money, but it was still not enough. They asked Ian to help take revenge on the dragon. Saying that they believed in his victory over the black dragon, Cheng replied that he could help them. They, in turn, were incredibly happy that Ian agreed, noting that even if he doesn't succeed, he still won't give up. The man replied that his words were already enough, but they still believed that Yang would defeat the dragon. Cheng smiled and said goodbye to the poor people, wishing them all the best. They reciprocated. At this moment, Yang's phone rang and he hurried to pick up the phone from Xian, who screamed at him, asking where he had been all day, because her mother hired him to guard her and not mind his own business. Cheng immediately went to the Chu family mansion, where the capricious Lin was waiting for him. Running up to the house, Ian looked at the time and realized that he got there quite quickly, in just half an hour. At that moment, he turned his attention to the old man, who was again sitting on the curb. Ian approached him and said that it was a coincidence to meet him here again. After which, he gave him some money for food, and said that the next time he didn't have money, he would look for Ian. The old man remained silent in response and looked down with his sad gaze. Cheng then went to the house of an angry Xian, who literally turned red with anger, and asked where he had been. He carefully took her by the shoulders and replied that she wanted him to come back, and he came, after which he instantly closed the door to the room in front of her and began to hold her. The angry Lin still did not let up, saying that he never explained where he had been missing for so long. After a few minutes, she calmed down, and there was silence outside the door. Ian exhaled with relief and got ready for bed, pulling himself up in front of the window. But at this time, a ball of moonlight flew out of his pocket and headed upward. Cheng took him in his hands and greeted him, noting that they had not seen each other for a long time, he asked if he wanted to drink wine, which stood on the table, but in return he would ask him just one question. Yang asked if he could use its energy, and how it could enter his body so easily. Moonbeam vaguely replied that Cheng could use his energy for his own purposes. Then Yang asked if it was possible to test his strength now. He turned away from Cheng offendedly, hinting that he had not done what he promised. He, in turn, gave him a bottle of wine, and the Moonbeam began to drink it greedily. Ian said that he had enough, asking if he could now demonstrate his energy. The drunken ball responded positively, then Cheng took it into his hand, and the lunar beam grew into his palm. Ian noticed that this began to happen, after which, he pointed his hand towards the window. His palm began to tremble and sparkle. Ian was excited for the moment and eagerly awaiting the result. His hand seemed to ignite with magic unknown to him. He also held his hand out the open window. At that moment, something inexplicable began to happen. Some kind of energy beam literally came from his palm, and was directed directly at the tree post, which, as a result, was badly damaged and smoke was coming out of it. Stunned, Cheng thought that this was a pretty cool ability that he had no idea about. The next morning, Yang woke up and hurried to go to school with Xian. She, in turn, was sleepy, and therefore moved slowly along the street. At some point, Lin noticed a tree broken in half. She immediately asked Cheng what happened, because the tree was intact. Yang said that they were late for school. Meanwhile, the bell for class had already rung and they were approaching the school. Yang tried in every possible way to hurry up the young and spoiled Xian Yilin. At this time, his ex was walking towards them, who was extremely surprised to see him with a young girl. In response, Yang Cheng remained silent, simply ignoring her, but little Lin. He said that they were here to study, asking a counter question what this aunt was doing here. She was at a loss, and she replied that Zhang Long does everything for her, and she will soon become a teacher at Nanchang University, and Yang is a loser. Xian immediately boiled and was already heading towards her, wanting to attack with fists, but Cheng pulled her back. They turned around and headed to the classroom. Lin asked why he pulled her away, because it was necessary to punish this impudent person, adding that she doesn't understand at all how he could even fall in love with someone like that. Cheng saw Teacher Bing being pestered by an unknown person with flowers, and confessed his love to her. And Luo replied that she was not ready for a relationship now, and asked him not to pursue her anymore. But the impatient guy grabbed her hand and began to say nervously that his father is the general director, and many girls dream of being with him. She asked him to leave her alone. He did not understand what was going on. Cheng couldn't stand it and walked up to him, then abruptly grabbed his hand. And he said that he would beat the crap out of him so that he would no longer pester and harass women. He, in turn, called him a little bastard, which was the last straw of Ian's patience. And he immediately twisted his arm, causing him to scream in pain. Cheng looked at him arrogantly and asked whether all this was legal or not. He, in turn, did not answer anything, but just sat and held his hand. A worried Luo Bing ran up to him and asked if everything was okay with Yang. Cheng replied that everything was fine, but it was better for her not to communicate with such scum anymore. At that moment, students ran up to him and reported that Xian had been kidnapped. He was shocked. Yang immediately went to look for her. He arrived at Tongning Street. More specifically, it was located on Tongning 123rd Street. Approaching the chessboard, he began to examine it carefully. He thought that this was the same place. Yang Cheng slowly opened the door when he suddenly heard something behind him. He turned around and saw an unknown person running towards him with a mace in his hand, after which he immediately struck him on the head, thereby breaking his stick. The bully was in disbelief to discover that the club actually broke on his head, and Ian was absolutely calm and unperturbed. He looked at the unlucky bastard. At that moment the others arrived. They had daggers in their hands. They said that he was the only one against them. Urging each other to stab him, one of them tried to stab him with his dagger, but Cheng literally grabbed the blade with 2 fingers and held it. Then he asked where Yilin, whom they had kidnapped, was. The other one told him that he shouldn't be so arrogant, since he had a gun in his hands. Ian advised him to try to shoot him. The bully was not himself from such a statement. Then, after a few seconds, he still could not stand it and decided to shoot. The bully pulled the trigger on the pistol, resulting in a shot. The bullet instantly flew into the shoulder of Cheng, who was still calm, after which, the deformed bullet bounced off him and fell to the ground, leaving only a mark on his body and a hole in his clothes. He, in turn, sat down on the floor. And he said that Yang was the devil, Cheng asked her they were keeping Xian. The bully had no choice but to point to one of the doors, which Yang immediately knocked down, and he saw Lin, who was tied to a chair, with her mouth covered with tape. There were cigarette butts and food scraps with empty bottles scattered around the room. Ian looked pitifully into her tear-stained eyes, realizing that he had finally found her. At the same time, he held the bully by the head with one hand, which he seemed to have forgotten about. Xian screamed with her mouth closed, telling him to hurry up, because behind her there were 3 more scoundrels who pointed their guns at him, and they ordered him to let their brother go, threatening that they would blow his brains off. He shouted that they should not shoot, since the bullets had no effect on him, which made them laugh out loud, saying that this couldn't happen. One of them said that even though they are brothers with him, money is more important. Cheng took advantage of the moment and quickly threw dice at them, thus, knocking the weapons out of the hands of all the villains. He then swept through them like a hurricane, inflicting sharp and powerful blows to each of them. They scattered in different directions, and literally a moment later, Ian stood among the beaten hooligans. One of them said that this would not happen again and begged for mercy. Cheng turned to him and said that a minute ago he wanted to shoot him. He decided to pretend to be a fool, saying that his hand was just itching and he wanted to scratch it. Ian walked up to him and bent down, and taking him by the hand, asked if it was his hand that was itching. After which, without waiting for an answer, he broke his arm, and he screamed in pain. Cheng turned to the others and asked if they were itching. They replied that they were not itching anywhere. Yang said that he could forget about everything, but because they kidnapped Xian, he couldn't let them leave so easily. Cheng said that he had several questions for them, and if they lie to him, they know what consequences await them. But Yang asked again who ordered them to kidnap Yi Xianlin. They immediately responded that it was actually Zhou Liren. Then Cheng asked who this Zhou Liren was and what he was like. They said that he was Zhou Bob's father. Yang asked why he would kidnap Xian if he could just come to the school and deal with him, or he wanted Cheng to come here. One of them replied that he had no idea why he did it. He shouted that they really didn't know why Zhou Liren had planned this, and they began to swear by the gods and everything they could. Yang hurried to ask the last question, which gang they were from. The hooligans answered that they were from the gang, the head of the dragon. After the interrogation, Yang hurried to untie poor Xian, saying that they were finally going home. Lin rushed into his arms with tears in her eyes and thanked him. Cheng carefully brushed her hair and said that this was just his duty. Then she asked if it was true that he was not afraid of bullets. Yang replied that he was just scaring them, because a person cannot help but be afraid of bullets. Lin noted that only God cannot be afraid of them. After taking Xian home, Yang hurried to the hospital in Changnan City. He went to the reception desk to find out which ward Zhou Bob was in. He was told that he was on the 5th floor in the 13th ward. Cheng immediately went to the 5th floor, to his room, to ask a few questions. Approaching the indicated chamber, Ian paused at the door and used X-ray vision to eavesdrop on what was happening there. He saw the nurse, Bob in the hospital bed and his father next to him, who told Bob that he had to take care of himself first, and the rest could wait. His son claimed that everything was fine with him and there was no need to worry about him so much. The father said that this young Cheng should die for daring to beat his son. Bob asked if there was any news about this. Liren replied that as soon as he goes to save Xian, he will be finished, and after that he will return Lin to him, and Bob will do whatever he wants with her. Bob asked his father if Cheng goes to the police, what to do then. He replied that he has many people who will deal with him. Having added that he was not afraid of some brat who had absolutely no experience, Yang began to get angry. Bob said that now he would make Lin beg for mercy. Liren smiled in response, noting that his son was doing well. At this moment, Yang suddenly opened the door to the ward and entered it. Liren asked who he was. Cheng looked at them arrogantly and asked if they were surprised. After which, he said that he knew everything, because he had just heard everything himself. Liren asked why he didn't save Lin then. Yang replied that he had already done it. Liren said that this was impossible, because there were 20 armed men there. Cheng replied that this was not a problem for him. Bob's father shouted that he wouldn't let go of someone who bullied his son so easily. Without hesitation, Yang attacked him with his fists, and he, in turn, was surprised by his courage. Cheng dealt him a strong blow, causing Liren to fly into the wall, which he himself damaged. Meanwhile, Bob, who was watching what was happening, took a stick from the bedside table, and he intended to strike Cheng from behind, which was as if one step ahead. Turning around, he abruptly grabbed this stick and said that he looked pathetic. After which Joe Bob hit with the same club, thereby knocking him to the floor. Bob landed with a crash and rather painfully, still not understanding why Ian was so strong. Ching came closer to him, and looking angrily into his eyes, asked, "What did he just say about Xian Lin?" And as always, without waiting for an answer, he slapped Bob in the face. Liren crawled on the floor and begged Ching to stop beating his son. Ian, in turn, continued to beat Bob mercilessly, ignoring his father. After which, he once again slapped him in the face and said that his son is someone's daughter, and no one cares about it. The enraged Liren replied that if he survived today, he would do everything to finish off Ching. Ian said that he wanted to see how his son could get less damage thanks to his rich and influential dad. Then he delivered another powerful blow to Bob's chest area. Thus, breaking several of his ribs, the crunching of bones was heard. Joe Bob curled up into a ball, saying that it looked like his bones were broken. Liren, picking up a large bottle of water from the boiler, again demanded to stop beating his son, having said that Bob only insulted Xian, and there is nothing wrong with that, adding that they have money, influence and power, and they can say whatever they want. After which, he threw a bottle of water at Ian, which flew into his head. An angry and wet Ching looked into the eyes of a distraught Zhou Liren. He literally froze in place for a while, glaring at him. Zhou Liren looked at him the same way, not knowing what to expect from Yang next. At that moment, one of the hospital workers, hearing noise in the room, knocked on the door. And he asked what was going on with them, while simultaneously trying to open the door, which was locked by Cheng from the inside. Liren shouted for them to call the police immediately, as the killer had entered the ward. Yang hurried to stop him by grabbing Zhou Liren and throwing him into the wall. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor. Bob told him not to go near his father. Ian turned to him and walked closer, then leaned down and continued. After beating Bob, Liren again asked him to stop beating his son, saying that it was all his fault. Cheng turned to Liren and asked him why he didn't think about this when he was planning everything. Then he stepped on Bob's foot and continued to look towards Liz Hen. Zhou Bob endured this painfully and literally screamed in wild pain. Suddenly the door to the ward opened, and Yang was pleased with himself. He hurried to the exit, casting another glance at Zhou Liren. The nurse fearfully tried to stop the confident Cheng, but he only turned in her direction for a second, after which he continued to head towards the exit. He looked after him in fright, realizing that it was better not to touch him. Cheng slowly walked towards the Chu mansion. He thoughtfully walked to the door, from which the embittered Xian Yilin flew out like a bullet. She stated that he went to see his ex. Ian replied that she cheated on him, and therefore would never return to her again, adding that even though he is her bodyguard, he should have personal space. The offended Xian said that she understood everything and hurried to leave him in splendid isolation. In the evening, Mrs. Chu said that it was only thanks to him that everything worked out for Lin, noting that she had not thought about how strong he was. Adding that Liren has a small status, but for her he is an empty place, she reassured Yang, which, in turn, thought that this lady was clearly not telling something. Madame Chu asked Cheng how the Jinghua company's investigation was going. Ian replied that he followed one manager, but did not find anything suspicious, adding that there was something wrong with the roof. Most likely they were not involved. Chu replied that he would handle it anyway, then asked if he knew how to swim. She kindly invited him to go with her and swim in the pool. Cheng was taken aback by surprise and didn't know what to answer her. He just looked at her in surprise. Madame Chu came closer to him and took his hand, saying that swimming next to her can also be considered protection. After which she asked if he had swimming trunks with him. He replied that he did not have swimming trunks. Chu invited him to swim naked. Ian was completely upset, because he clearly didn't like this idea. After some time, they came to a beautiful and large pool. Ian stood in his shorts and was very shy. He literally blushed from the awkwardness of the moment. Madame Chu, in turn, was too relaxed and posed defiantly in front of him. At a certain moment, she smilingly called him to go down into the water with her. He still stood near the pool for a few seconds, then decided to take a swim, and he jumped into the pool, diving deeper into the water, which he really liked. He began to truly enjoy swimming in the pool. At a certain moment, he swam too close to Xian, who also decided to swim. She immediately reacted, telling him to watch where he was swimming. At that moment, Yang was admiring the spoiled Lin, who demanded that he sail away from her. Which he did. Madame Chu laughed and said that everything was fine, urging him to continue swimming with them. Xian pestered him with questions about why he didn't invite her to swim with him. Saying that he was looking at her mother and watching her closely, Ian tried in every possible way to deny it. He thought that the apple does not fall far from the tree, as they say, and he was caught looking at his mother. The next morning, Ian was walking around the schoolyard when he suddenly noticed to Teacher Bing, who was talking to someone on the phone, saying that she would try, and asking for forgiveness. She walked in circles, clearly nervous, and begged to let her father go. Yang was very interested in who Luo was talking to. After which she burst into tears, and after finishing the phone call, she jumped into the water. Cheng could not believe that she wanted to commit suicide. He realized that she needed help. Yang at that very second jumped into the water after her. He began to look for her underwater. Then, finding her going to the bottom, he hurried to her to quickly get her out of the water. Cheng took her by the arms and began to slowly but surely swim to the surface. After some time and some difficulty, he finally pulled her out. Luo was unconscious. Ian understood that it was necessary to act very quickly and extremely carefully. Cheng looked closely and listened to her to understand whether she was breathing or not, then asked her forgiveness. And he began to quickly unbutton her jacket so that he could then carry out massage actions. Luo Bing still did not open her eyes and lay unconscious. He hurried, and he immediately began to massage her chest to pump out the water from her lungs. After which, he began to give her artificial respiration, since there might not have been enough time. After a while, Luo began to slowly open her eyes, thereby coming to her senses. Then Bing finally woke up, and Cheng immediately asked how she was feeling. She noticed that he saved her. She rushed to hug and thank him. Ian noticed that suicide is not a way out of the situation, and any problems can be solved. Bing continued to cry on his shoulder. Yang tried to calm her down. At this moment, Cheng began to inhale an incomprehensible smell that came from Luo. He said that a fish swam into her jacket, its tail peeking out of her pocket. Luo looked at him in fear. Yang, in turn, hurried to get the fish. Reaching into her pocket, which startled Bing, she suddenly moved away from him. After which he finally took out the fish and asked the teacher why she wanted to commit suicide. She told him the story that her father had lost all their money gambling and now they were deeply in debt. And today they called her and said that they kidnapped her father because he could not pay. In this connection, they demand that she sell her body until she pays off the entire debt, and if Luo does not do this, they will kill her father. Ian asked why she didn't immediately go to the police. He himself understood that selling a body was too trivial. Bing replied that they were from the Dragon Gang, and they had connections both in the police and in the government, and if she called, they could kill her father. Ian thought that this gang needed to be exterminated, and suggested that the teacher transfer this matter to him. Luo said that he was just a student who could not do anything to them. Cheng nevertheless assured her otherwise, and finally teacher Luo agreed, since she had no choice. He asked her they were keeping her father. Bing replied that she was told to come to the center of Bath's XXX, and most likely her father was there. Cheng asked her to hurry home so that she would not catch a cold, and in the meantime he would go and deal with this gang. After which, extremely confident Ian headed straight to Bath XXX. The teacher looked after him. Then Luo still shouted out to him to be careful and make sure to come back alive. Cheng turned around and told her not to worry, and expected good news from him. After which he hurried to meet the Dragon Gang. The teacher sadly realized that this could end badly. After some time, he already entered the territory of Cupulan, where he was met by unknown smiling girls. Cheng noticed that one of them took his arm, which he did not expect. Then the other one came up from the other side. They said that it was very hot today, and he was wearing outerwear, and they offered him to take a bath. Cheng began to play along to extract information from them about whether Long had come today. One of the girls told him that Brother Long was not there yet and invited him to play. Trying in every possible way to hug Ian, he understood that Long had not arrived yet, which meant he had to wait. Cheng dodged the girl's embrace, who noticed that he had good reflexes. Yang said that he would wait for Long downstairs. At this moment there were many more girls. They literally surrounded him from all sides, offering him to have fun. They were getting closer and closer, and Ian was carefully considering his plan of action. Having never come up with anything, he couldn't find anything better than just running away from them. But the girls were not appeased, and therefore Cheng chose 3 of them and said that he would only go with them. The girls hurried to take him to the room. One of the girls said that she would help him take a bath. After which, they took him to the bathroom, from where he safely escaped, bare-chested. saying that he would be back soon. Cheng left the room and suddenly heard voices outside the door talking about the old man's daughter, who was supposed to pay off his debts. Yang listened and used his X-ray vision to see Father Luo tied up. Members of the dragon gang stood near him and demanded that he force his daughter to go sell her body. One of them said that if the old man's daughter spent the night with him, he would talk to the boss to reduce the debt by a couple of yuan, saying that he knows how beautiful his daughter is, who works in Changnan. At that moment Yang knocked down the door. Cheng brazenly entered the room and asked if they were having enough fun. One of them asked who let him in here, then threw a half-eaten piece of meat at Ian. Cheng naturally dodged with ease and looked at the bully angrily. The other one, holding a metal pipe in his hands, asked him to give him the opportunity to deal with Cheng, after which, he immediately rushed towards Ian, trying to hit him with a pipe. Yang soared up, thereby simply jumping over the villain and ending up behind him. Namely, near the tied-up father of teacher Luo Bing, Yang held on to the back of the chair. At that moment, the bully threw a metal pipe at his head, which, in turn, flew away from Ian, already completely deformed. Cheng turned around and kicked the scoundrel, as a result of which he broke his arm. The other one picked up an automatic weapon and told his brother to step aside. Then he took aim at Ian and prepared to shoot, slowly pulling the trigger. At this moment, Cheng used his super ability, the Moonlight Blade, thus, immobilizing the dragon gang member, who did not understand what was happening. In turn, the ability twisted his legs, preventing him from shooting. Yang then hurried to untie Father Luo and dragged him along, telling him to keep his head down. They immediately tried to leave the scene, running towards the exit. Suddenly, armed guards came out of the front door and immediately opened fire on them. Cheng told the teacher's father to immediately lie down on the floor, which he did. Ian covered it with himself. At the same time, seeing the door to another room, he opened it, making sure that there was no one there. After which, he instantly dragged the old man inside and told him not to stick his head out. Teacher Bing's father thought that this young man looked quite scary, then closed the door. The old man began to doubt whether he should run away now, because he understood that they would most likely find him later. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and Cheng, a little stained with blood, approached the old man. Having said that they could now go, they went out into the corridor where the bloodied guards were scattered. Luo's father was shocked by what he saw. Yang asked him not to stare, but to hurry up and leave, since the building was still full of guards. After which, he immediately dragged the old man along, who was simply in a stupor. They went to the window, and Father Bing asked what Yang was up to, because jumping down was a bad idea in his opinion, adding that Cheng came to save him, and now he needs to get back from the third floor. Yang hurriedly replied that he was his daughter's friend and could trust him. Then he grabbed the old man's clothes and pulled him along. Jumping from the window, Cheng landed first, and with his outstretched arm helped Father Luo land softly. The guards who ran to the window were extremely surprised by how they simply jumped out from the third floor and disappeared. After a certain period of time, Yang and Father Bing arrived at his house with their daughter. A tearful Luo ran up to her father. She was overwhelmed with emotions. Her father promised never to gamble again. The teacher turned to Cheng and sincerely began to thank him, saying that she had disturbed him today. Ong replied with a smile, that everything is fine. At that time the father said that this guy is not bad, and they will be a good couple. Luo replied that Yang is her student. The old man noticed that nowadays there is no need to be so narrow-minded, and he is not against seeing Cheng in the role of a son-in-law. Yang said that now they need to hurry up and pack their things, and he will take them to the hotel, since the dragon gang may come to them. They did so. The next morning at school, where Yang and Xian naturally headed, Teacher Bing came into the classroom and said that she had brought breakfast for Cheng, who was sitting at the same desk with Lin. Ian replied that he had already eaten, and thanked her, saying that if there were any more problems, she should contact him, which clearly did not please Xian, who elbowed him. Cheng turned to her. Lin asked since when Teacher Luo treats him so well. He replied that he has no idea. She then suggested that they could have a very close relationship. Ian replied that they had no relationship, and he urged Lin to watch his language. During a physical education lesson, Cheng played basketball with the students. At that moment, an unknown male voice called out to him, urging him to come out and deal with him. Yang turned around and saw an unknown person in Teacher Bing, who asked Cheng to leave. Yang threw the basketball away and looked arrogantly towards the bully. Luo worriedly asked why Yang didn't run away. He in turn asked her not to worry about him. After which he approached the scoundrel. He asked if he was Yang. Cheng replied that if he did not touch her and left, he would remain intact. The bully took out a weapon and threatened him with immediate violence, saying that Cheng was too self-confident. Ian, who imagined himself to be something unknown, was absolutely calm. Then, using his abilities, he dealt with all the hooligans, and taking teacher Luo Bing in his arms, he hurried to leave this location. Thus, taking Bing to a safe place, Yang said that she would leave quickly, and he would go and deal with them. Luo had no choice but to agree. Cheng still returned to the basketball court, where the bandits were waiting for him, one of whom opened fire on him from his automatic weapon. He shot for several seconds, telling Cheng to finally say goodbye to his life. However, confident Yang easily dodged the bullets flying in his direction, after which, he hurried to meet such a stubborn hooligan. Yang ran up close to him, which the bandit clearly did not expect. He looked at him in surprise, and he immediately kicked him in the head, which in turn landed painfully on the ground. Behind Chen, the rest of the dragon gang had already run up, and he turned his attention to them. And the next second he used his super abilities. As a result, he began to throw everyone around. They could not resist his strength. The female half of the students, watching what was happening from the side, shouted love words to him, saying that he was their only favorite fight and savior. Yang ignored their cries in every possible way. At that moment, Xian approached him and said that it was cool to be a hero, and she didn't understand why he wasn't happy with it. Teacher Luo Bing thanked Cheng for his help, from which Yi Lin literally boiled, and nervously said that there was still something between them, and she stepped aside. The teacher said that Yang needed to explain to Xian, because his opinion about her was important to her. Cheng was surprised, because this Lin constantly plays pranks and confuses him. Yang thought for a while, then hurried to catch up with Xian. He ran after her and shouted at her to stop, but Lin ran further. A little later, Cheng was informed that the director wanted to see him. Where he went. Ian went into the director's office and asked why he called him. The director looked thoughtfully at Cheng and said that he knew about the fight that he started. Yang replied that it was not he who started it, but the one who came to kidnap teacher Lu, and he just protected her. The director said that Yang still recognized the fact of the fight. Cheng tensed. After which the director noted that high school is a place for learning, and if he wants to fight, then there are many such places. Cheng brazenly asked how much the dragon gang paid him. The director was not himself, and abruptly jumped out of his chair. Ian said that he had already lost his qualifications as a teacher. He shouted that this was a lie, and he was his principal, who could expel Ian from school at any time. Cheng replied that it is quite suspicious when the dragon gang comes with a showdown, and he sits calmly in his office. The director said that Ian was an overly self-confident brat who would soon crawl to him on his knees. Cheng looked at him arrogantly and replied that he was clearly flattering himself. The director wanted to say something else, but Yang calmly left his office and left. He was literally taken aback by Cheng's behavior, realizing that the situation had turned against him, and Yang dared not to listen to him. The assistant director said that you need to be careful with Cheng, since he is on good terms with Xian, Madame Chu's daughter, which is an influential figure in the underworld, especially since Long's gang has shrunk because of Yang. The director understood that Cheng would not be an easy prey. Meanwhile he and Lin were walking home from school. Suddenly he felt something incomprehensible, but he understood perfectly well that the threat was very close. Cheng grabbed Yi Xian's hand, who did not understand what was happening to him. Literally a moment later, Yang caught an arrow flying at Yi Lin with his hand. She saw this, but still pushed him aside, telling him not to touch her. Cheng, meanwhile, carefully examined the arrow, and realized that it was most likely poisoned. After a few seconds, Yang heard a whistling sound and turned towards Xian. He saw that another arrow was flying straight at her. Cheng hurried to Lin to help. She also saw it and didn't know what to do. At that moment Yang caught the arrow with his hand, but it slipped right out of his palm and then fell to the ground. Cheng understood that he needed to be extremely careful and protect Xian. This time the arrow was very close to the target, and the task became more difficult. Behind them was a crowd of schoolchildren who literally admired Ian. Cheng immediately urged Lin to leave here, because it was very dangerous to be here. He took her hand and pressed her to him, looking out for the one who shot at them. Realizing that the killer was clearly a professional, as he was careful and acted secretly, and the crowd of people only increased his chances. Cheng looked around the schoolchildren in search of the shooter, and suddenly saw, as if from a screaming crowd of people, another arrow flew towards them. Yang covered Yi Lin with himself and was preparing to catch her, but at that moment, a slightly different idea occurred to him, which he hastened to implement. Cheng immediately hugged Xian tightly to him and got ready, after which, when the arrow was already close, Yang took off with Lin into the heights. While floating in the air, he noticed that another poisoned arrow was flying at them. Cheng tried to use his abilities with the help of the moon ball in his palm. However, nothing happened. Yang was extremely surprised and did not understand why the skills did not work. He realized that the light ball did not provide any power today, and therefore did not work. Yang still tried to use his abilities again, and this time luck was on his side, because suddenly, the moon ball still broke the arrow, causing it to fall down. Where Cheng directed his gaze, he discovered the shooter hiding behind a tree. Due to this, Yang hurried with Lin to land on the ground to get the scum. What they did literally a few seconds later, Cheng told her not to go anywhere and wait for him. He himself hurried to meet the shooter, whom he soon overtook. Yang grabbed the unknown man by the clothes, which he clearly did not expect, and only managed to cast a frightened glance in Cheng's direction. After which, he raised him above the ground, thus using a crossbow from which he fired poisoned arrows. He fell to the ground. Yang instantly crushed him with his foot, and began to beat the shooter. Cheng threw him on the ground several times and dealt strong blows to his body. He did not even think of sparing the unknown man, and continued to brutally beat him. People began to come closer, watching Cheng's brutal punishment. Ian drew attention to them, and therefore understood that it was necessary to change the location. He simply took it as a rag and hurried to take it to another, quieter and inconspicuous place, where he soon laid him on the ground, and he gradually began to come to his senses. The unknown man waited a moment and suddenly threw a knife at Ian, which he dodged. Cheng noticed that he was wasting his strength, which he clearly would still need. At that moment, the unknown person pulled a gun out of his pocket, trying to shoot at Ian, which, in turn, quickly knocked the weapon out of his hands. Cheng noticed that he was strong, and if he had not been a killer, they could have even been friends. After which Ian asked who the customer was who sent him. He tried to catch his breath, coughing up blood, and he replied that there was no point in shaking the air in vain, because he would not tell him anything. Cheng asked if he was hired, or if he was still offended by Lin, and therefore wanted to kill her. The unknown person held an incomprehensible thing in his hands and said that threats had no effect on him, provoking Cheng in every possible way. Ian noticed that he still wouldn't calm down. The killer was smiling at him on his knees. At this moment, Cheng reached out to him with his hand. The unknown person noticed this. He opened a certain capsule in his hands, and then hurried. He threw its contents into his mouth, causing it to start shaking. Ian didn't understand what was happening to him and simply stayed away from him. A few seconds later, the killer fell to the ground, his eyes rolled back in his head and his nose bleeding. Cheng could not understand what prompted him to take such an unexpected step. Having examined the contents of the killer's pockets, Jan unfortunately did not find anything that would help to understand who he was and who the customer was. Realizing that it would not be easy for him, since the unknown person committed suicide, he then returned to Xian, who began to question him about what happened to the killer. Yang remained silent in response. Wondering, she asked whether Cheng had killed him, or whether he had escaped, but Yang continued to remain silent. They silently walked through the streets, all the way to the Chu mansion, on the threshold of which Madame Chu was already waiting for them. She asked Cheng if he was injured. Yang replied that he was okay. Chu noticed that he did everything very carefully. Xian said that if he had always been nearby, she wouldn't have been captured. Chu noticed that although he is strong, Yang cannot always be there. Lin said that even if she is destined to live a short life, even without the attack, she would have died, but she was destined to go a long way. Chu said that she was talking nonsense. Yang didn't even think that she believed in fate. Cheng said that we need to be careful and continue the research. Madame Chu said that it was time for Xian to sleep, and Yana called for her. They walked further into the house. Lin went to her room at a certain moment. Madame Chu turned around and, with a smile on her face, asked her to wait here while she changed her clothes. After some time, she appeared before him in a t-shirt and sweatpants. Chu began to exercise and at the same time talked to Cheng, saying what she was going through. Because before it seemed like it would be much easier, but now she is very scared and worried about Xian Lin. Yang hastened to reassure her, saying that he would do everything to protect Xian from danger. Madame Chu confided in Cheng, saying that she had sinned in the past, and now she constantly feels when danger is coming. Yang was extremely surprised that someone like her would ever be a sinner. Madame Chu calmly continued to practice on the mat, looking at Cheng. The next day, at the high school, the principal held a meeting of sorts, who approached the microphone and checked whether it was working properly, coughed. After which, he said that today's university-wide meeting was organized thanks to one young man, and asked Cheng to stand up, which, in turn, suggested what could be awaiting him now. Ian absolutely calmly walked towards the director. Approaching the director, he stated that Cheng, like everyone else, is obliged to comply with the rules established by the university, adding that he will bear responsibility for the fight that happened on the site. The director said that since this was his first offense, he was only suspending him from classes for half a year, on account of his academic leave. The angry crowd of students strongly disagreed with this decision of the director. Teacher Luo stood up for Yang, who said that he was not to blame, and personal hostility was not a reason for suspension from classes. Cheng asked her not to stand up for him, because she could get it too. The rector said that she, as a teacher, should watch her words and not challenge his final decision. At that moment, Xian Lin approached him and said that this was all untrue. The angry rector nervously said that she had no right to accuse him of slander. Yang tried to pull her away. Xian said that he did not like Cheng, and was punishing the innocent, and he needed to be removed. The director replied that his rabid classmate was throwing herself at the teachers, and approved a year of academic leave. Cheng looked into the director's eyes and replied indifferently that he didn't care. Lin still did not let up. Yang, heading towards the exit, dragged her along with him. She said that after such a rector no one would respect him, and showing him her middle fingers, she announced that she was also leaving. After a while, he and Xian were heading home when suddenly, and very abruptly, Xian, whom Yang did not immediately recognize, blocked their way, as a result of which he had already swung his leg at her. Xian, in turn, was taken aback. Out of surprise, she was confused for a moment, not understanding Cheng's reaction. He recognized her as Qian in time, and lowered his leg and looked at her, after which, she said that they had not seen each other for so long, and he began to fight. Yang asked for forgiveness, saying that he initially did not recognize her. Lin came closer and asked who she was. Cheng hurried to introduce them, saying that he and Xiao had worked together before, and Xian was his classmate. Xian, with a smile on her face, said that she had been looking for him for a very long time, and then they met by chance. Ian asked if no one was offending her anymore. She replied that everything was fine, and she received a salary, and it would be possible to celebrate. He happily agreed, at which point Lin intervened, reminding him of his responsibilities and that he should guide her through. Then Yang told Xian that he would take Xian home, and then they would go somewhere together. She asked him to write to her, saying that he would be waiting. After some time, Yang escorted Lin home and went with Qian to an establishment where they had a pleasant conversation at the table. Qian asked him not to torment him, and to tell him who this girl was, assuming that he was dating her. Cheng replied that she was just his classmate, and nothing more. At this moment, Qian admitted that she was actually looking for him, because she had one thing to do with him. He replied that he would help. After which, she instantly became sad and said that she received her salary and quit. Yang was quick to ask what happened and why she left work. Qian thanked Cheng for helping her find a job then, but she could not stand the pestering of her perverted boss and quit. Yang asked where she was planning to get a job now. Qian sadly replied that she had no idea. Cheng invited her to work for him as an assistant when he opened his own business. She replied that she was ready to work for him for free. At this time, Ian thought that the work of a detective would suit him. With his supervision and incredible dexterity, he replied that he would think about it. Cheng said he wanted to become a private detective, and Qian could handle business contacts and advertising. Xiao happily replied that knowing Yang, they would clearly be successful in this area. After having lunch with Qian, Cheng immediately headed to the Chu family mansion, where he met a young girl unknown to him, whom he asked who she was. She quite confidently stated that she got a job as a new driver for Madame Chu, who came up from behind and replied that she was indeed their new driver, adding that they told her that she was wonderful behind the wheel. Xian asked what happened to the old driver, because he had barely worked and was a great driver. Madame Chu replied that he was worried about his safety, after which he soon quit, as he most likely understood everything. Chu told her to start working tomorrow, and asked what her name was. She replied that her name was Lin Pan, and asked to work now. Madame Chu replied that the mansion was at her disposal, adding that she would have something to talk about with young people. The new driver thanked her and said that she would immediately bring her things. Ian looked after her. Chu asked how Cheng is a new driver. He hastened to answer her that she doesn't really look like a driver. Madame Chu agreed, noting that she would simply drive the car. Yang was afraid to imagine what awaited him in a house with 3 women. At this moment, a dissatisfied Xian asked her mother why she needed such a seductive driver. She asked if Lin was jealous of her. Yi Xian replied that she was in no way jealous, she was just worried that there might be no peace in the house because of her. Madame Chu asked her not to worry about this, and since they are not studying now, they can enjoy their vacation, adding that something terrible happened in Changnan the day before, and therefore they need to be more careful. Yang Cheng tried to understand what such a terrible thing could happen there, which is what he asked Madame Chu about. She replied that someone in a black cloak appeared. He was moving quickly. The witness said that all the victims had their carotid artery bitten. Xian asked her again about the artery, since this meant that they all died from blood loss. Yi Lin then suggested that this style of killing seems to be unique to zombies. Chu said that zombies are all fiction and they do not exist, but they still need to be careful, especially on the street. Yang understood that it really was a zombie, but among his acquaintances he only knew Xian Ling. Cheng continued to speculate that she could very well be the killer, and that night Xian left him a scroll, after which Ian went to meet his new neighbor and find out if she needed help. He went into her room and greeted her, saying that she was his new neighbor, but Pan remained silent in response. Cheng stood with his hand outstretched for a few more seconds, after which he felt extremely awkward. Pan, in turn, continued to ignore him in every possible way, which infuriated him. Yang said that she was quite rude, but she could have just said hello for the sake of decency, or at least answered somehow. Pan stopped arranging her things for a moment, realizing that he would not leave her behind. Turning to him, she asked what he expected, so she would greet him as standard and ask his name. Cheng saw only coldness in her eyes, and understood that he would still suffer with her. Then, leaving her room, he rudely replied that she was great, and his name was Yang Cheng, and said goodbye. At the door he found Xian eavesdropping, who said that rudeness should be answered with rudeness, noting that he had become cooler. Cheng smilingly replied that a quarrel with her would not force him to admit defeat, and she might not even count on it. After which he hurried away, saying that he was going on business, and Lin could rest at home. She replied that she would go with him. Ian turned to her and said that he would go alone, because he had his own personal matters. Cheng was standing in his room by the window, talking to someone on the phone. He was told that everything would be ready during the day. The agency was called Paris, and later he would receive the address. Ian replied that he would arrive tomorrow morning. The next morning, he met Qian at the high-rise building. She asked what it would be called and how many workers he would hire. Cheng replied that they would be called private investigations, and that only he and Qian would be the workers. She clarified, he confirmed. Yang said that she would be the internal boss, and he would be the external one. Her task would be to distribute advertising and call clients. And everything else was on it, after which they walked along the corridor of this high-rise building, looking for their office. Qian thanked him, saying that she didn't even know what she could do for him and how to repay him. Ian smiled and said that she could repay him if she was a very good boss in his company. Cheng patted her on the head. She, in turn, promised him to become an excellent boss, and even shed a tear. Satisfied, Ian returned home, leisurely strolling through the streets of the city. He was extremely proud that he still helped poor Jia Zhe with her work. At that moment, someone shouted around the corner, asking someone to help him. Cheng immediately turned the corner and headed in the direction where, on the contrary, all the people were running away. He then noticed what looked like a zombie. Ian couldn't believe his eyes. It was a large humanoid zombie. Its skin was dark blue, and it was chasing the poor girl, which in turn ran away from the monster. At a certain moment he pushed off the ground, and he jumped towards the girl screaming in fear. She seemed to have no chance. As he flew, he pushed the car to the side, as if the car were made of paper. Yang shouted that it was a zombie, calling on other people to quickly run away from here. Meanwhile, the zombie still overtook the girl and grabbed her by the shoulder. Yang urged him to let the girl go, but the zombie ignored him. Then Cheng jumped towards him, and he was already quite close to the zombie, who still managed to turn the girl towards him and bite her on the neck. Blood began to flow from her eyes. She could not move. The zombie continued to bite her. Literally a second later she was covered in blood, but he didn't stop. Cheng tried to kick him hard, but he didn't even move. Yang felt that he had rather tough skin that could not be penetrated so easily. And he understood that he could not harm him in any way. Cheng tried to figure out how to resist him. He, in turn, was not distracted for a second, and drank all the blood from the girl. Her skin turned gray. Yang understood that he was a zombie, judging by his actions, but why he was different from him, and larger in size, he guessed. That it was some kind of dark zombie that outstripped him in strength, size, and was as if armored. Yang tried his best to attract the attention of this dark zombie, but he continued to ignore him. He casually threw away the girl's body, which no longer contained blood, after which he froze in place for several seconds, doing nothing and not going anywhere. Then he suddenly turned towards Cheng and laughed, looking into his eyes. Yang realized that for some unknown reason he felt funny, which brought some horror even to Cheng. Ian noticed that this all happened near the XXX restaurant. The zombie appeared in front of Cheng and began to come closer. Yang, in turn, did not retreat. Cheng began to remember what Xian Ling told him. Supposedly he is the owner of bloody flesh, but he did not understand what this meant. Yang asked the zombie coming towards him to stop. He stood up, not understanding what was happening. Cheng said that he wanted to ask one question. The dark zombie looked at him, opening his mouth from which a rather long tongue came out. Yang asked him how he knew about the bloody flesh, but the zombie did not answer. Instead, he jumped at Cheng with a wild roar and tried to stab him. Ian managed to dodge, and noticed that he was too aggressive. One got the impression that he was not a person at all, because he did not say anything. At that moment the zombie pushed off from the ground. And again he angrily jumped at Cheng, who still could not understand how exactly to confront this monster. Literally in a moment, the zombie again delivered a heavy blow, which Cheng tried to block. The monster again used its roar. Ian covered himself with his hands, sliding along the asphalt. Cheng had never met such an opponent before. He pushed off from the ground. And he attacked the dark zombie, trying to knock him to the ground, but he stood rooted to the spot. Then Cheng fixed his hands and held him for a while. The zombie seemed to be at a loss for a moment and did not know what to do. At least the expression on his face spoke of this. Then he was still able to twist Ian's arms, thereby intercepting him. Ian began to realize that the big man was weaker than this, but in this position, his legs were free, and Cheng hurried to give him a powerful kick in the stomach, as a result of which, the dark zombie screamed very loudly, thereby again creating a literal whirlwind. The sound was so piercing that it could be heard on several streets, which demolished everything in its path. Yang had great difficulty staying in place, after which, the dark zombie threw Cheng far back, flying several meters. Ian landed very painfully on the asphalt, literally making a hole underneath himself. Cheng caught himself thinking that the zombie's breath stank even worse than the garbage cans. He hurried to get up, realizing that he most likely would not calm down, and will pursue him. Cheng stood up and began to peer at the zombies, who, meanwhile, was already very close to Ian, and was looking at him. Cheng understood that this could not continue for long, and there must be a way to defeat this zombie. Because in close combat, it was useless to fight with him, and there was only one option left. While Ian was pondering how to defeat the dark zombie, he fiercely rushed at him. He jumped into the heights, and Cheng realized that he needed to act very quickly. He also took off from the ground, and jumping even higher, found himself above the zombie. Cheng thought that he had caught him, and this time he would definitely be able to defeat him. And he immediately used his ability, the moon blade, his palm sparkling. And the next second, an energy beam hit the zombie in the chest area. What he clearly did not expect. As a result, the dark zombie fell to the ground with a roar. Cheng naively believed that this was all, and he finally defeated the evil monster. However, everything was not so simple, because the zombie got to his feet with a hole in his chest. Yang was shocked that he survived the moon blade skill, realizing that the zombie was too strong, who in turn hurried to meet Cheng. With even greater anger, he began to strike Ian with powerful and painful blows, one after another, hitting Cheng's body, who was literally at his limit. He asked him to stop, but the dark zombie was merciless and continued to press on him. He delivered merciless blows to Cheng again and again, who at one point collapsed to the ground from powerlessness. Ian was unable to continue the fight. He lay all bloodied on the asphalt, realizing that he could not be stopped, but on the contrary, the zombie seemed to only become angrier, who slowly approached the helpless Ian and raised his hand, growling. He dealt another strong blow to his body, literally pushing through his ribs. Cheng could not do anything about it, and only drowned in his own blood. The dark zombie sat above him, believing that Ian had died, and looked into his eyes. The beaten Cheng did not want to believe that this could all end for him. Because Yang was not going to die, his eyes began to darken. The zombie, bending over his face, again demonstrated its furious roar. Cheng tried to use his abilities again, his hand began to sparkle. After which, he dealt an instant blow to the dark zombie in the stomach, which he clearly did not expect. Because I thought that I had defeated Ian, and that was where everything should have ended. But after Cheng's powerful blow, he flew far back and landed on the ground rather painfully. With another hole in his stomach, he had no way to get up so quickly. Yang still couldn't believe that he had managed to use the energy of the Milky Ball. He took advantage of the fact that the dark zombie was still lying immobilized on the asphalt, and he hurried to quickly leave this place before he woke up. The dark zombie, in turn, did not want to admit defeat. He growled with all his might, somewhere in the sky, but at the moment he could not get up to catch up with Cheng. After some time, Yang, although not by much, still moved away from the zombies. Half dead, he slowly walked through the empty streets of the city, periodically stumbling from powerlessness. Cheng said that as soon as he returns home, he will definitely thank his savior with wine. At this moment, something inexplicable began to happen to him. Ian could not understand what was happening. A moment later, his wounds began to heal, and he gradually stopped feeling pain. Cheng extended his hands forward and began to look at them closely, realizing that the wounds had disappeared. Only his clothes were covered in blood, otherwise his body was completely restored. What could not but please him, Cheng understood that he could regenerate. Thinking that this was the effect of a zombie body, he went home joyfully. Meanwhile, a beautiful pink sunset was painted in the sky. Yang gradually approached the Chu mansion, where again I met the poor old man, who was sitting thoughtfully by the curb. Cheng came closer to him and greeted the elder, who turned towards Yang. After examining his bloody clothes, he asked whether Cheng was seriously injured. Ian replied that he was fine, he just accidentally fell on the road. Streak looked at him for several seconds, after which he said that they needed to say goodbye. Cheng, not understanding what was happening and why they had to say goodbye, asked the elder again. Yang hurried to say that if the old man had problems, he would definitely help him. The old man noticed that Cheng was too kind, adding that to judge a person's nature by his personal qualities is too absurd and careless. The elder thanked him for everything, and presented him with one trinket in the form of an amulet, which he supposedly found somewhere. And he asked to wear this souvenir until he stopped liking it, and handed it into the hands of Ian. Smiling, Cheng thanked the old man and put this amulet around his neck. The elder said that this amulet would protect him from evil things. Yang hurried to stop him for a second to give him a little money. The old man slowly got to his feet and said that he did not need money, because Cheng had already helped him a lot. He gradually moved away from Ian, who in turn looked after him. The elder at some point asked what the name of this young guy was. Yang shouted loudly after him that his name was Yang Cheng. The old man said that the world was vast, and they will definitely meet again someday. Cheng waved his hand, after which, he slowly headed to Chu's villa. Meanwhile, it was completely dark, where, going up the stairs to his room, the evil Xian was already waiting for him, which demanded an explanation from him, where he had been for so long, and who he was with. But she discovered that there were numerous blood stains on it, because of which she was literally horrified. She seemed to have had a paradigm shift, and Xian already politely asked if he was okay. Cheng explained that it was actually the blood of those he fought with, not his, and he was not injured. Yi Lin calmed down for a moment. Yang said that everything was fine, and urged her not to worry about him. She asked if he went to the Dragon Gang, which surprised Cheng greatly. Yang smiled and asked if she was really that worried about him. Xian stammered and replied that if he was killed, there would be no one to protect her. Cheng turned and said that he seemed to be thinking too much, adding that he would go to his room. Yi Lin asked her to tell her what he was thinking about now, and in return she would pay him with money. Yang turned around and replied that he didn't seem obligated to tell her that. What angered the young lady, who muttered something incomprehensible after Cheng left. Having already approached the door to his room, Ian turned and asked what happened to the new driver yesterday. Xian replied that Pan told about the problems at home, due to which she would come tomorrow. Yang asked if Madame Chu found out. For more information about Lin Pan's personality, Yi Lin replied that she seemed to be from an orphanage, because she was an orphan. Cheng noticed that this is suspicious. If she is from a shelter, then what problems could there be at home? At this moment, Xian noticed the amulet hanging on his neck and asked what it was. Ian replied that it was just a pendant that his friend gave him. Lin extended her hand and asked him to show her. Ching removed the pendant from his neck, after which he gave it to the curious Xian, who looked at it for a long time. Then she asked to give her this amulet, which Yang was extremely surprised by. Ching replied that he couldn't do it because a friend gave it to him, but he could buy her another one if he wanted. Xian looked at Ching sadly, then said no less sadly, asking if it was a woman who gave him this pendant. Ian replied that in fact, he got it from the elderly mister, and put it back on his neck. Yi Lin said that in that case, it really belongs to Ching. Yang slowly went into his room and sat down on the bed, looking at the moon disk hovering in the sky. At this moment, the moon ball sitting on the chest of drawers squeaked, as if reminding of its existence. Ian was very happy to see him. He realized that he had used up too much energy, and thanked him for saving his life. Declaring that he would do whatever he asked, the moon ball rushed around the bottle of wine. Ching realized that he wanted to drink. Ian didn't understand how the little ball's liver still hadn't fallen off from the amount of alcohol he drank. Ching said that he would give him as much to drink as he wanted, but he should not forget that they needed to improve their communication. The lunar ball, in turn, squealed joyfully and dangled around the room, with a bottle of wine, which it never stopped emptying. Ian urged him to drink more slowly, because no one would take this bottle of alcohol from him, and if he didn't have enough, then Cheng will get more for him. The ball kept flying around the room and continued to squeak. Yang watched him smiling. He thought about the dark zombie, knowing full well that he would not be able to eliminate it at the moment, since he was very strong. And if nothing is done, then he can continue to pose a threat to all the townspeople, and since Ian wanted to kill this zombie, he took the scroll. After all, it was necessary to become stronger, in which this ancient scroll, which he began to carefully study, would help him with. Where one interesting picture was drawn, it depicted a creature similar to a dark zombie, under the sun. Ian thought that he needed to stand under the rays of the sun, which zombies are so afraid of. Then he came across an image of someone collecting rainwater in a container. And there was an incomprehensible clearing on fire. Ching did not quite understand what was being said in this picture. Next was a drawing of a man with weapons in both hands that looked like scythes or something like that. Ching seemed to have a safe with a lot of money, the password of which he didn't know, and an absolutely drunk Moonbeam sat to the side. Tired and understanding little, Yang put the scroll in the chest of drawers and went to bed the next morning. Waking up, he immediately went to the bathroom, where he washed his face and brushed his teeth. Suddenly, Xian opened the door behind him. He asked her to leave the bathroom, because he was in a t-shirt and shorts, saying that he needed to knock. She was clearly not in the mood, and therefore, not very politely, she asked Ian to take her to the library. Ching asked why she needed to go to the library. Lin noticed that there was too much talking. At that moment, a new driver, Lin Pan, showed up and offered to give them a lift to the library. Xian agreed. After a while, Ching changed his clothes to go out into the yard to practice. He stood and looked out the window, where the weather was beautiful and the sun was shining. Yang went out into the yard. He didn't understand how he would now react to the sun, after merging with the lunar ball, and the battle with zombies. And he wanted to check this. Ching immediately put his hand out into the rays of the scorching sun. He himself was in the shade of a tree, and waited for the reaction of his skin in the sun. But nothing happened. The hand did not hiss, which means he was no longer afraid of the sunlight. Yang again put his hand in the sun to finally make sure of this, and closely watched what would happen. At that moment, Xian saw him through the window. She asked what he was doing and why he was standing with his arm outstretched, because he looked ridiculous. Ching tried to concentrate as much as possible and did not pay attention to the spoiled girl, after which, he himself went out into the sun, because he was still overcome by some doubt. Cheng was in the sun for a long time. It was quite hot. But nothing happened, no characteristic hissing. He took up the amulet given to him by the old man. And he thought that the last time his body reacted negatively to the sun, he was not wearing this pendant. Cheng hurried to take off the pendant and hung it on the branch of the tree closest to him. And he began to wait for his body's reaction to the sun's rays, standing there for a few seconds. As a result, his body hissed as before, and began to literally smoke. It was at this moment that Xian and Pan approached him. Lin noticed that his hand was smoking, and asked what he was doing. Cheng turned around and hid his hands behind his back, answering that it seemed to her, because his hands could not just take it and smoke. Meanwhile, Lin Pan turned her attention to the pendant that was hanging on the tree and took it in her hands, examining it closely. What Ching clearly didn't like, who instantly pulled the amulet out of her hands. Pan asked what it was. Ian replied that this was a gift from his friend. He realized that this was literally his treasure, because with it he was not afraid of sunlight. After which, they still went by car to drive around the city, in search of the library that Yi Xian needed. Having arrived at the right place, Pan said that the lady could get out here. Yi Lin asked her to wait or take a walk if she got bored, and she would call her when they returned. Pan agreed. They got out of the car, and Yang asked why Xian was so polite to her, but always rude to him. Yi Lin replied because he annoyed her. Cheng jokingly asked the aunt for permission to hit Xian for educational purposes. After a while they entered the library and approached the elevator, the doors of which opened, and a crowd of unknown men came out. A suspicious gang of people approached Xian and Cheng, staring at them arrogantly. Yang tensed. Xian went behind him, because they clearly did not look friendly. After which, one of them asked Cheng if he had seen this woman. Handing over the photo of teacher Luo Bing, Yang understood everything at this moment. Thinking that her father could offend them again, and they wouldn't leave so easily, Cheng answered quite confidently that he had not met this person, and hurried to leave with Lin. He, in turn, said that he would definitely find this woman, who was clearly in trouble. Yang and Lin hurried into the elevator, and Cheng nervously pressed the button. The elevator doors began to slowly close. However, at this moment, the hand of an unknown person held the door, after which they opened it completely. Cheng began to understand that now the library would not be calm, and was already ready. These were the same bandits who asked them about Luo Bing. One of them noticed that the girl's face was quite familiar to him. He wondered if they had met her before. Then it dawned on him. He remembered that she was the same lady from the Yi family, saying that they had finally met her, and since they had not found Luo, they would take Lin away. At this moment, Cheng asked them if they were from Lan Shou's gang. They rudely replied that he shouldn't care. Ian, grinning, asked if they knew who the guy was who saved her that time. One of them replied that it was definitely not him, while the other, on the contrary, began to understand that it really was this guy. Cheng replied that it was he who saved her then, and at that very second he struck one of them in the jaw. Then he hurried to deal with the others, beating them with his lightning-fast and powerful blows. Cheng told Lin to leave here, and he would catch up with her later, while simultaneously delivering his crushing blows to the hooligans. They tried to attack him again from all sides at the same time, but their luck clearly abandoned them at that moment. Gradually it began to dawn on them that he was really beyond their strength, and they instantly ran away, saying that he was the devil, and not a person. Yang turned around and found that Xian did not listen to him, and was nearby all this time. She said that he was cool. One of the gang, running away in fear, thought that he would never contact Long Shou again. Cheng stood in the middle of the bandits he had scattered, then stepped on one of them with his foot, and he looked at the reaction of the others. They lay beaten and frightened, having lost all their pathos. Suddenly, Ian heard someone behind him screaming and begging for help. He turned around and saw a guy shaking with fear. Cheng came closer to him, told him to shut up and move out of the way, saying that he was just looking for one person. He, in turn, thanked Yang for not touching him. Cheng calmly entered the elevator. After some time, he met Lin again, who asked how he was feeling and whether everything was okay. Cheng, without answering, grabbed her hand and said that they needed to leave this place immediately, since they couldn't stay here. Xian, who did not understand anything, replied that she had not yet warned Lin Pan that they had finished. Yang insisted on his own, saying that now, for safety, it is better for them to go to a place that only they know about. Lin immediately called Pan to inform her that they would get there on their own. They left the building, and Cheng said that he knew how to quickly get to the right place. Xian asked how he could help them with this. Cheng tore off the bottom of his t-shirt, and he asked her to trust him, and later he would definitely explain everything to her. Yang blindfolded her and told Lin not to peek. She agreed, on the condition that he would then tell her what was really happening. Ian threw her on his back. She held on to him. He naturally agreed to explain everything, after which he immediately pushed off from the ground and soared into the air with her. They hovered high above the ground, and flew quite quickly towards the wind. Xian thought that the wind was quite strong, and nothing bad would happen if she quickly took a look. He pulled the blindfold over his eyes with one hand, and was literally shocked by what he saw, but did not show it. At that moment, Yang asked her if she was peeking, because he noticed that she had temporarily removed her hand. Xian immediately replied that it seemed to him and she was not spying. She herself began to think about who this Yang Qing really was, since he had inhuman skills. After a certain time, passing all the high-rise buildings and landing at one of them, out of breath, Qing said that they were there and lowered Xian from his back, who stood with a blindfold over her eyes and asked if she could finally take it off. Ian, smiling, replied that now she could take it off, because they had successfully reached the required location. Yi Lin instantly took off the blindfold and found that they were near a beautiful high-rise building. They arrived at his new office. Xian noticed the sign and asked where they were. Yang noted that this was a rather stupid question, adding that the main and only thing she should know is that this is a safe place. They entered the door of his office, where they were greeted by a joyful Qian, who politely greeted the guests in the form of Yang and Xian. Yi Lin asked why he brought her here, noting that she saw this girl near the school. Qing did not answer. He hurried to approach Qian and said that he would explain everything to her now, starting to talk to her. At this moment, the capricious young lady Xian shouted that he had no right to ignore her. Yang did not pay attention to her. And Qian said that he would leave Yi Lin here for now, adding that a little later Luo Bing would arrive here. Qian asked what he was planning. Cheng, in turn, quite confidently stated that now is the time to punish the Long Shou gang and their minions. Qian noticed that it was quite dangerous to go there alone, trying in every possible way to dissuade him from this decision. Yang said that it is better to attack unexpectedly first, because this way there is a much greater chance of winning than to constantly defend. At this time, Qian said that if he still failed, then the problems would not end for them. Qing noticed that she was right, so they must be wiped off the face of the earth, once and for all. Lin hastened to say that she didn't mean that at all, but that it was unsafe to go there alone. But there was no stopping him. Yang said that he would now pick up Miss Luo Bing at the hotel. Xian was indignant. Literally after some time, Cheng was already close to the hotel, and he hurried to go up to teacher Luo's room, who asked why there was such a rush. Yang replied that he would take her to a safe place, since the Long Shou gang was searching the entire city in search of Bean. They left her room. Lu gently took his hand, and smilingly asked what he planned to do next. Understanding what Luo was hinting at, he did not answer directly, but only said that he would take care of everything, and she had nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, it was already quite late. The sky was covered with small sparkling and cold stars, and a crescent moon hovered in the sky. During the investigation, Yang learned about the whereabouts of several very important figures of this same Long Shou gang. The ninth brother was a terrible libertine who had fun in clubs at night and relaxed in his villa during the day. And the leader of the gang, the White Elephants, spent a lot of time in saunas or other hot springs, and it was not so difficult to take action. Due to the large number of Black Dragon doppelgangers, no one knew his whereabouts. Qing thought that today everything would happen, and karma would overtake them all.